Hello! The story takes place in Ontario, located in central Canada. Ontario is the most populous province in Canada, known for its abundant water resources such as the St. Lawrence River and four of the Great Lakes: Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. However, the most famous landmark in Ontario is Niagara Falls. In southern Ontario, there's the Greater Toronto Area, the second largest financial center in North America. To the west of Ontario lies a place called Caledon, known for its dense forests, fresh air, and rich natural resources, just an hour's drive from downtown Toronto. Many people often visit Caledon for vacations, and our story today takes place there. On April 13, 1992, Susan's family held their annual maple syrup party. Every year on this day, Susan would invite friends and family to her farm in Caledon to join the party and enjoy delicious, homemade maple syrup. The farm in Caledon was an inheritance from Susan's father, whose property spanned from downtown Toronto to Caledon. Susan and her younger brother Ian inherited the properties together, each owning a house in Toronto and a farm in Caledon. Susan and Ian grew up together and were very close, but later each started their own families. Susan lived with her husband, Orville, and had a grown son named Jamie, who lived independently in Toronto but kept in close contact with his parents and family. Ian lived with his wife Nancy, and they had no children, but kept a small cat. Normally, Susan and Ian lived in downtown Toronto, but during holidays they often returned to their farms in Caledon. Whether in Toronto or Caledon, Susan and Ian's homes were never far apart, so they frequently visited each other and had keys to each other's houses. That day was the day of the maple syrup party at the Caledon farm, so Susan got up early to prepare. As time passed and evening approached, around 40 to 50 guests invited by Susan arrived at the farm. However, strangely, her brother Ian and his wife Nancy had not yet appeared. In fact, Susan had not seen Ian for a few days and could not reach him. A few days earlier, Susan and her husband Orville had discovered Ian's car parked beside the cabin on his farm. They thought Ian had come from Toronto to the farm, but 2 or 3 days passed and Susan and her husband still didn't see Ian. Therefore, they used their key to access Ian's farm and open the cabin door. On the bed in the first-floor bedroom, 2 neatly placed bags contained Ian and Nancy's clothes, suggesting they had packed to attend the party. Ian was not in the cabin, but everything in the house seemed normal. Susan and her husband thought Ian and his wife might have gone somewhere. However, what Susan didn't expect was that even on the day of the party, Ian and his wife still didn't show up. Normally, Ian was very reliable and would definitely inform them if he couldn't make it due to being busy. This made Susan worried. She tried calling Ian but couldn't reach him. Susan then contacted Ian's friends, but no one knew where he had gone. Nancy had lupus, a chronic, recurrent disease that when flared up caused butterfly-shaped red rashes on her face. This disease could not be completely cured. In the winter, patients needed to keep warm and avoid exposing their skin to cold air. Thus, during a winter or cold weather, Nancy usually didn't visit the Caledon farm. Although it was April and spring had arrived, the temperature in Caledon was still not high. Typically, Nancy wouldn't visit the farm at this time, but she always attended the annual maple syrup party regardless of the cold. This time was clearly an exception. Susan truly couldn't think of any reason why the two of them would suddenly be absent from the maple syrup party without any prior notice. Believing they might still be in Toronto, Susan called her son Jamie, who lived there, and asked him to take the keys to Ian's house to check if they were home. Jamie followed his mother's instructions and took the keys to Ian's house in Toronto. When he arrived, he found the front door locked, the lights off inside, and Nancy's Chevrolet still parked there. Everything seemed normal. However, Jamie quickly noticed that the mailbox outside the house was filled with mail and newspapers, suggesting that no one had collected them for several days. Upon entering the house, Jamie saw Aunt Nancy's handbag open on the bed in the bedroom. After checking all the rooms, Jamie called his parents to report the situation. Upon hearing this, Susan and Orville felt something was wrong because Nancy was very meticulous and would never leave her handbag in such an obvious place, especially with it open. Ian and his wife had a small cat that they would always take with them when traveling. So Susan and Orville asked Jamie to return to Ian's house once more to see if the cat was still there. If it was, it meant Ian and his wife hadn't gone far. Jamie entered Ian's house again, carefully checking each room. Finally, he found the small cat in the basement, but it seemed to have been neglected for some time. The food bowl was empty, there was no food or water, and the cat meowed continuously upon seeing Jamie. Clearly, it had been starving for days, and Jamie felt a growing sense of unease. After feeding the cat, Jamie continued searching the house. Eventually, he found Nancy's spare car keys and decided to check her car for any clues. Jamie went to Nancy's Chevrolet, opened the door, and began inspecting the car. A handful of tissues on the driver's seat caught his attention. These tissues had some red stains on them, and there was a faint, unpleasant odor inside the car. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Jamie went to the back of the car and opened the trunk. The sight before him was unforgettable for the rest of his life. Uncle Ian and Aunt Nancy were lying lifeless in the trunk, their bodies cold. Realizing something terrible had happened, Jamie immediately called the police. He then called his parents in Caledon to inform them of the tragic news. The Toronto police quickly mobilized forces to the scene to secure it and begin the autopsy process. In the trunk were the bodies of Ian and his wife. Ian was lying on the outside while Nancy was on the inside. Unlike Nancy, who was not wearing clothes, Ian was fully dressed. The autopsy revealed numerous bruises and abrasions on Nancy's body, indicating she had been bound at the wrists, ankles, and neck, with deep bruises on her shoulders. The initial assumption was that before death, the victim's hands and feet had been tied and her mouth had been gagged. Ian had strangulation marks on his neck, and his right wrist, thigh, and knee bore signs of binding. There was a bruise on his right cheek. Both had died from suffocation, and the time of death was determined to be more than 5 days prior. Nancy's clothes were not in the car. Ian was fully clothed, and his wallet was found in his pants pocket containing his ID and credit cards, but no cash. The house was very tidy, with no signs of forced entry or a struggle. On the bed, in the bedroom, was an open handbag, and the credit cards inside were intact. The police speculated that a small amount of cash might have been taken, but not much. Aside from this, they found nothing unusual at the scene, so they decided to start their investigation by looking into the victims' movements and relationships before their deaths. Ian, 55 years old, worked in real estate, a busy and high-pressure job. 6 days before the incident on April 10th, Ian decided to drive to the cabin at the Caledon farm to relax for a day. He informed his colleagues of his plans, but no one saw Ian after that day. Although no one saw Ian at the farm, Susan Orville, local residents in Caledon, and patrolling police officers all saw Ian's Cadillac parked outside the cabin, so everyone believed Ian had been at the cabin. Ian's wife, Nancy, 49 years old, was a nurse who often worked at schools in Toronto and volunteered at homeless shelters. Nancy knew about her husband's plan to spend a day at the cabin to relax. However, Ian had said he would return home to Toronto in the evening. That evening, Nancy returned home from work, but Ian had not come back. Nancy mentioned this in a conversation with friends, expressing her concern. At 7:36 p.m. that day, there was a call from the cabin at the Caledon farm to Nancy's home in Toronto. The call lasted 3 minutes. After that day, neither Nancy nor Ian went to work, and their colleagues and friends didn't know where they were and couldn't contact them. The investigation confirmed that the last time anyone saw Ian and Nancy was on April 10th, 6 days prior. The police went to Ian's cabin at the Caledon farm to search it. The cabin had a simple door secured with a padlock. There were no signs of forced entry on the front door, but the bedroom window showed signs of being pried open with a tool. The suspect might have entered the house through the window. Inside the cabin was very tidy. There were a few empty beer cans in the kitchen and no signs of a struggle. However, the police found some bloodstains on the stairs leading to the second floor. The blood samples were sent to the Toronto Forensic Science Center for testing, which revealed that the blood belonged to Nancy, indicating she was likely murdered at the cabin. However, the police couldn't find any other clues in the cabin. Near the farm, investigators discovered an octagonal barn built in 1894 with unique architecture. In the late 19th century, octagonal barns were popular in Ontario, but the barn near Ian's farm was the only remaining one in Caledon that still retained the town's unique style. The planks used were vertical with additional side roofs. Octagonal barns were primarily used to store grain and were popular due to their practicality in agriculture. They also had a religious foundation, as it was believed that the octagonal shape had no dark and deep corners where evil spirits could hide. Today, octagonal barns are no longer used for grain storage, but their spacious interiors make them ideal for storing belongings. The police thoroughly searched the octagonal barn, but found nothing unusual. Why did this couple die so mysteriously? One theory suggested that Nancy had an affair. Her lover, after learning that Ian would be at the cabin, pried open the window to break into the house with the intent to kill Ian. However, unexpectedly encountering Nancy, who was there looking for her husband, the lover panicked and killed her. However, after investigation, the police discovered that Ian and Nancy had been married for nearly 25 years, had a very good relationship, and were considered a loving and faithful couple by everyone. Checking Nancy's call logs, the police found no signs of her having an affair. At the scene, the perpetrator left almost no clues, leaving the case at an impasse. After a week of investigation without progress, the police could not identify any suspects with a clear motive. Therefore, they decided to invite a criminal psychologist to assist in the investigation. Criminal psychologists are well-trained professionals who can profile a criminal by analyzing the crime scene, victims, and modus operandi, including the perpetrator's gender, age, occupation, personality, and hobbies. This helps the police narrow down the investigation scope and solve the case more quickly. Criminal profiling emerged in the 1970s but was not widely used in actual criminal investigations at that time. Some people considered these experts as mere charlatans, and their analysis results were not accepted as evidence in court. However, the local police decided to invite criminal profiler Kate Lines to investigate this case. She had trained at the FBI Academy, and this was one of the first cases Kate participated in as a criminal profiler. Kate arrived at the cabin at the Caledon farm, and after a thorough examination found nothing unusual. The inside of the house was very tidy, with no signs of a struggle. Kate believed the perpetrator had subdued Ian in a short period. Next, Kate inspected Nancy's Chevrolet, where the bodies of Nancy and her husband were found in the trunk. Kate noticed that the driver's seat was adjusted far back from the steering wheel, indicating that the last driver was a tall person. However, Nancy was petite, suggesting someone else drove her car and adjusted the seat. Both Nancy and Ian had ligature marks, but the locations of the marks differed. Nancy's limbs were bound, while Ian's marks were mainly on his right wrist and thighs. Kate noted that Nancy's ligature marks were deeper, indicating the perpetrator used more force to bind her while she was still alive. Considering Nancy's condition and injuries, the perpetrator treated her more brutally and ruthlessly than Ian. Based on the injuries of the two victims, Nancy suffered more pain while alive. Clearly, the perpetrator harbored significant animosity toward Nancy. Kate believed Nancy was the primary target, the perpetrator was male, and the motive could be sexual in nature. Additionally, Kate provided further profiles of the perpetrator. Perpetrators of violent interpersonal crimes are usually around the same age as their victims. However, in this case, the perpetrator could subdue both victims and move the bodies to the trunk alone. Kate believed the perpetrator was a strong young man aged 35 to 45. Given Ian's good relationships and lack of enemies, Kate thought the perpetrator was not an acquaintance but a stranger. Since the perpetrator left almost no traces at the scene and the house was very tidy, it suggested a premeditated crime. The perpetrator might have been in the Caledon area for some time, easily found the secluded cabin, and knew the victim's circumstances. Kate speculated that the perpetrator did not have a stable job, lacked close relations, and was at risk of reoffending. Based on studies of similar cases, Kate believed the perpetrator was an unsociable, eccentric, quiet, and introverted person. However, when necessary, he could still communicate normally. The perpetrator's appearance was unkempt. He dressed sloppily, and he did not pay attention to personal hygiene. He might have had a criminal record for minor offenses. Kate speculated that on the day of the incident, Ian drove to the cabin in Caledon, but unexpectedly encountered an intruder. This man used a weapon to subdue Ian. Under duress, Ian called his wife in Toronto from the cabin, saying he had changed his mind and would not return to Toronto that evening but would stay at the cabin overnight. The intruder then forced Ian to concoct a reason for Nancy to drive to the cabin so that they could be together. After receiving the call, Nancy drove her Chevrolet to the Caledon farm. However, as soon as she arrived, the man subdued her. The intruder then assaulted and killed Nancy in the cabin and hid her body in the trunk of her car. For some reason, the perpetrator forced Ian to drive Nancy's Chevrolet back to their home in Toronto, where he then killed Ian and also hid his body in the trunk. Kate believed that the perpetrator was very dangerous and obsessed with torturing others. Such criminals often tend to insult and abuse their victims, causing both physical and mental pain. There was a high likelihood that the perpetrator would reoffend, and future victims could suffer the same tragic fate as Ian and Nancy. With the support of the criminal psychologist, the police gained an understanding of the perpetrator's characteristics. Shortly after, they made an important discovery. A garbage bag was found in a ditch 100 meters from the cabin at the Caledon farm. Inside the bag were an empty beer can similar to the ones found in the cabin, some torn newspaper pieces with dates 4 months before the incident, a bag of feces, and several handwritten papers. Some words were crossed out, and the content related to weapons, tanks, and warships, resembling some kind of military equipment list. Before Ian and Nancy were murdered, the local media had reported a series of house burglaries. Due to the cold weather, many residents of Caledon had moved to the city, leaving many houses unoccupied. A cunning thief took advantage of the homeowner's absence to sneak in and steal their possessions. He stole jewelry, clothing, and other items, but was never caught, and left no trace, making the situation mysterious. The local residents called this thief the house hermit. This thief had a characteristic habit of leaving behind some pornography magazines, paper or plastic bags containing feces, and many pages of handwritten military equipment lists. The items the police found in the ditch outside the cabin at the farm were identical to those left by the house hermit in the burglarized homes, including the handwritten military equipment lists. Therefore, the police believed that the murderer of Ian and Nancy was indeed the house hermit, who had been causing trouble in the town recently. However, this thief did not always act perfectly. Due to the extensive media coverage, many Caledon homeowners worried that their houses would be broken into, so they occasionally returned to check on their homes. One time when the house hermit was preparing to break into a house, the homeowner unexpectedly returned. The thief reacted quickly, using a weapon to subdue the homeowner and demanding to be driven to Toronto. On the way, the thief told the homeowner that he was wanted for fraud. He knew that wealthy people like the homeowner would likely have homes not only in Caledon, but also in Toronto. The thief demanded that the homeowner take him to their house in Toronto to hide for a while, but the homeowner refused. When they reached a busy intersection in downtown Toronto, the homeowner suddenly stopped the car and demanded that the thief get out. With no other option, the thief fled. Although his whereabouts were unknown after he got out of the car because he had been unexpectedly discovered by the homeowner, he did not have time to erase his traces. The police collected the thief's fingerprints from the victim's house, but since the thief had no prior criminal record, they could not find a match in the database. Suspecting that the house hermit was involved in Ian and Nancy's deaths, the police reviewed his file and discovered that the homeowner's description of the house hermit's characteristics closely matched the profile provided by criminal psychologist Kate. This significantly increased their suspicion of the house hermit. The police's top priority was to find him. They believed that the handwritten military equipment lists might help identify the house hermit. Therefore, they published photos of these lists for the public, hoping someone would provide a lead. Shortly after, they received a tip that became the key to solving the case. The informant was a woman named Allison, who identified the house hermit as David Snow. When David was born, his parents had hoped for a girl but were disappointed when he turned out to be a boy. When David was 3, his family moved to Orangeville. 2 years later, his sister was born, but his mother suffered from postpartum depression. Since then, his parents lavished all their love on their youngest daughter. When David was 13 years old, his father passed away due to a serious illness, causing his mother to once again collapse emotionally. After this event, he began to exhibit rebellious behavior within the family, often insulting and even physically assaulting his mother and sister. He was also unable to communicate normally with others and frequently watched pornographic films. Later, he opened an antique shop in the local area, but it had to be closed down due to bankruptcy in the year the incident occurred. Allison said that she had noticed an article with the title "Police Search for Clothing Enthusiast" and was very surprised to realize that the author of those words was David. 4 years ago, Allison and her husband moved from Toronto to Orangeville and got to know David. Although David had bright blue eyes and was somewhat shy, Allison still felt there was something strange about him. Most people in the town considered David to be an eccentric because he would frequently disappear without telling anyone. However, Allison's husband Darius befriended him, and they worked together to find a job repairing the town's old train station. Afterward, they became business partners, jointly purchasing an abandoned building in the town and opening an antique shop. Allison said that although David was a quiet person after she had her first child, she saw a completely different side of him, as he was very loving and caring towards the baby. She felt that David was truly human at that moment, but he still frequently disappeared without reason and showed little interest in the antique shop's business. 1 year before the incident occurred, David disappeared again, and the antique shop's business fell into unprecedented difficulty. He did not inform Allison and her husband of the reason for his departure or his whereabouts. From that point on, the antique shop faced the brink of bankruptcy, and Allison's family's financial situation also fell into crisis. She and her husband went to David's warehouse to find some valuable items to compensate for the losses, but to their surprise, while searching through the belongings, they accidentally discovered a secret. In a box in his warehouse, there were cut-out pornographic images from magazines, and they had also found a thick book about military equipment. Both felt chills upon discovering these items. The things found in David's warehouse left a deep impression on Allison's mind, so when she saw the article, she immediately realized that her tip was incredibly important to the police. The police promptly conducted an investigation on David Snow, revealing that he was accused of fraud and was wanted by the Orangeville police. They compared David's fingerprints with those collected at the previously burglarized cabin and confirmed they were from the same person. David was indeed the house hermit thief plaguing the town. Believing David might be involved in Ian and Nancy's murders, the police searched his home in Orangeville. This time they found crucial evidence linking David to the murder of Ian and Nancy. At David's house, the police discovered numerous pornographic materials. More importantly, they found a black leather briefcase containing dozens of photos of an octagonal barn. Currently, there are not many octagonal barns preserved in Ontario, and the barn in Caledon had a distinctive local style. This led the police to be almost certain that the structure in the photos was the octagonal barn near Ian's farm. Allison mentioned that David had once shown her and her husband these photos of the octagonal barn. David seemed to like the place very much and knew there was a farm near the barn. The police believed that David had visited the octagonal barn many times and was very familiar with the surroundings. During this time, he learned about Ian's family situation and developed malicious intentions toward Nancy. The police launched a large-scale manhunt across Ontario with the entire police force searching for David for over a month without finding any trace of him. Just when the manhunt was at a standstill, the case took a turn. One day, Ontario police happened to watch a news report on TV about a suspect being hunted by the police in Vancouver, British Columbia, in Western Canada. According to the report, a patrolling officer in the Seymour Mountain area had heard strange noises in the forest. Upon investigating, he discovered a man tying two women to a tree. When the man saw the officer, he immediately panicked and fled. The two rescued women reported that they had been taken from their workplace and then repeatedly beaten by the man. He had forced one of them to drive him to the mountains and then tied them to the tree. If they hadn't encountered the police, they might have lost their lives. The Vancouver police were making every effort to track down the suspect and had found some of his belongings in the victim's car, which became important clues in finding him. The Ontario police realized from the news report that the items left behind by the suspect were identical to those stolen by the house hermit David. The way he tied up the victims was also similar to how Nancy had been tied up. The police believed that the man the Vancouver police were searching for was indeed the house hermit David Snow. However, since it was a long distance from Ontario to British Columbia, the police checked data from major transportation routes. Finally, a ticket agent at the Toronto train station recognized David from a photo. He told the police that David seemed very anxious and wanted to buy a ticket as soon as possible. David's attitude was irritable and rude while buying the ticket, and he did not use his real name but instead used the alias David Wilson. With the ticket agent's testimony, the Ontario police were almost certain that David had reached British Columbia, and the man being sought by the Vancouver police was indeed David, just as the criminal psychologist had described. David did not stop on his criminal path, and the police were truly racing against time to quickly apprehend him to prevent further crimes. On July 12, 3 months after the murder at 4 a.m., the Vancouver police received an emergency call from a local restaurant. A man had attacked a 53-year-old female employee at the restaurant just before closing time and used a cord to strangle her. The restaurant's security guard discovered and timely intervened. Fortunately, the female employee was not seriously injured. Upon receiving the report, the police arrived at the scene and found a man exhibiting signs of panic trying to hide. Upon approaching, the police were extremely surprised to recognize this man as the house hermit David, whom they had been searching for. David was immediately arrested. Notably, the criminal psychologist had described 25 characteristics of the perpetrator, of which 23 matched David, particularly his age and motive, showing that her predictions were incredibly accurate. In the crimes David committed in Vancouver, the victims were treated brutally, indicating David had perverse sexual desires. 5 years after the murder, the trial for David Snow for the deaths of Ian and Nancy was held at the Toronto court. After deliberation, the court declared David Snow guilty of murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. Additionally, David was convicted of 22 other charges, including robbery, kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and many other crimes. In 2008, 11 years after his conviction, David attacked another inmate in prison and threatened to kill him, resulting in another conviction. A year later, the Canadian correctional authorities deemed David an extremely serious threat to society if released. After the murders of Ian and Nancy, David gained a new nickname, the serial killer. Now, 68 years old, he will continue to pay for his crimes behind bars for the rest of his life. What are your thoughts on today's case? Please leave your comments below so we can discuss together. If you found this case interesting, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.